Hello and welcome to this beep boop of a gotcha guide. There has been a lot of talk since this book came out about whether 40k is getting too complicated. Well, Alfred Farius and myself are strong believers in the credence that you do not need to know every single rule in every single codex in order to play against them. So if you're new to the channel, the point of these videos is just to cover those rules. So we're not going to go through the codex datasheet by datasheet, line by line, but we're just going to tell you the things that you need to know in order to beat Admech. So let's start off then with the faction abilities, because if you're not aware of these, your opponent can actually really take you by surprise with them. So Alfred, do you want to talk us through the Canticles of the Omnissiah?
So the Cult Mechanicus units of the Adeptus Mechanicus have access to Canticles of the Omnissiah. Now each round they'll be able to choose which canticle they've got, and they've all got their uses. Shroud Psalm, they can have their army counters in light cover. The Remorseless Fist gives their +1 strength. The Incantation of the Iron Soul, they can ignore modifiers for combat attrition and give a 5-up Feel No Pain versus Mortal Wounds. Really good versus Smite Spam, things like that. Benediction of the Omnissiah, that lets them reroll 1 hit, 1 wound, and 1 damage for each unit, and that can be really tasty on something like a unit of Cataphrons, which have some really strong guns. You've also got Invocation of Machine Vengeance, where you roll an extra d6 when advancing and discard the lowest. You might see this late game to get that guarantee that they might get on that final point. And then finally be aware of Litany of the Electromancer, which is much better than it was as an 8th, because it's now -1 to be hit in combat.
And they definitely have multiple ways of using canticles that have already been used in the game as well, so just be careful of that. So the other side of Admech are the Skitarii, and they get access to Doctrina Imperatives that work in a similar way. There's only 4 to choose from, and they're basically reverses of each other. So you have +1 ballistic skill, -1 weapon skill, or the reverse, +1 save, -3 movement, or the reverse again, and your opponent can choose when to use these. Now they do have a negative effect, but the extra movement, as Alfred says, could be really great to get those late game points. +1 ballistic skill or weapon skill is going to be really vital in certain instances. And actually the Marshal can stop Skitarii units from getting affected by the negative parts of the Doctrina Imperatives.
So speaking of the Marshal, he is technically the only Skitarii character, but because he's the only one, let's talk about his Warlord Traits. So the Skitarii Warlord Traits are a bit unique because there are units with the data tether keyword, and those with the data tether keyword can be affected by these Warlord Traits no matter where they are on the battlefield. There are also broad spectrum data tethers, which are found on units like the Iron Striders, and that can allow them to choose Forge World Skitarii core units and give them data tethers, so basically, no matter where he is on the table, the Marshal will be able to affect units with these Warlord Traits. So what are they? He can choose a core unit to shoot and still perform actions, or a core unit to fall back and shoot, a core unit to reroll advances and charges, give them the benefit of light cover, or infantry and cover get an extra save, or he can make them fight first, or he can make them so that when they move they ignore penalties. I think the key thing here is with that data tether keyword, they don't need to be restricted by castling up as much and being close. They can be anywhere on the battlefield.
And so, of course, the Tech Priests have their own Warlord Traits that they get access to, so they can allow Cult Mechanicus core units to fall back in charge, they can allow Cult Mechanicus core units to be put into Deep Strike, and they have a bunch of other Warlord Traits that can help them out in terms of repairing and combat themselves, or just being more survivable. And there are, of course, Forge World specific Warlord Traits that are quite interesting. I'm not going to go through them all now, but I have put a bunch of them on the screen just for you to look at. But just to cover a couple of them, for example, the Lucius Warlord Trait allows you to put Transhuman essentially onto a core unit, making like a big blob of troops super tough to kill. Grya Warlords can allow core units nearby to heroically intervene, and for 6 inches, Styges Warlords can allow for a redeploy for 2 units. There's actually a lot of power in these Forge World specific Warlord Traits.
So in terms of Forge World specific relics, there are a couple of interesting ones as well. For Lucius, this is a very similar relic to the Veil of Darkness Necrons have. This can teleport the bearer and a core unit that's within 3 inches of them to anywhere on the board. Suddenly that there's a unit there that you didn't think would be there earlier on. Agrippina have the Eye of Zilexum. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. But they choose a core or a Cataphrone Servitor unit within 6, and they can reroll wounds against a single vehicle within 18 inches of the bearer. Now bear in mind they have a strat to give those Cataphren servitors extra toughness as well, so you can expect to see big blobs of Agrippina servitors. The skull of Elder Nicola is a really interesting relic. At the start of each shooting phase, enemy vehicles within 12 inches of the bearer can take mortal wounds. On a 2 to 3 they'll take 1 mortal wound, on a 4 to 5 d3, and on a 6, 3 mortal wounds. And that's each enemy vehicle. So if you've got a load of vehicles, do not put them near whoever's holding this. Exemplar's Eternity is one you should watch out for because you'll probably see it a lot. This lets the Scutari Marshal become a captain and a lieutenant combined, where his reroll 1s to wound also becomes reroll 1s to hit. Another one you might see a lot is Tempocopia. Now at the start of the fight phase, they'll select a unit within 3 inches of the bearer, and that unit fights last. So we're seeing more and more of these fight last abilities in 9th edition, so be careful where you're charging.
And if Admech players want to buff their characters even further, they can pay points in order to get Holy Orders. And there are 4 to choose from. All of them allow a type of stratagem to be used for 1 less CP once per game, and all of them have an initial part and an advanced part. Now, from the start of the game, they get the initial part, and if that character performs an action, which is something that is in the core rulebook, they can actually get access to the advanced part where they get some even more powerful abilities. So they're all pretty good, so we've put them all on the screen now. Alfred, what was your favourite one of the 4?
I think of the 4, my favourite is the Magi, specifically for the advanced part, Overloaded Safeguards. So for this one, in the command phase, they'll choose a Forge World core unit within 6, and then until the next command phase, when they shoot, unmodified hit rolls of 6 score an additional hit. Now you saw this a lot because this came up in Engine War in 8th edition, and there's a lot of units that have a lot of shots in Admech, and if they're doing 2 hits on 6s, that can be deadly.
Yeah, that's pretty great. My favourite is the Artisans. I actually like both parts of this. The initial part allows core and Cataphren servitor units to fall back and be able to shoot, but a -1 to hit, which is really great because obviously if you've got a shooting army, you don't want things to be tagged. And the advanced part is actually also pretty good. So if you're shooting a core unit within 6 inches of the Warlord, you actually add 1 to the strength of the attack.
So let's start talking about units. When it comes to HQ units, Admech characters for the most part can repair their vehicles. Admech have 4 types of Tech Priest. They come in essentially different flavors. First off, you've got your Manipulus. You can choose a unit and add 6 inches to the range of their guns. Pretty useful. The Dominus, he has his reroll 1s aura, so basically he's your captain, if you think about it that way. You've got the Engine Seer. He can choose a vehicle, although not robots, and give them +1 to hit. And then finally the new guy, who may or may not be Daedalosus, you've got your Techno-Archaeologist. Now reinforcements can't come in within 12 inches of him, and he allows you to choose Cataphren units, and they can perform actions as if they were infantry, and when they do this, they still get to shoot. I'd be remiss not to mention Big Daddy Call. He's a general beatstick, he's quite good in combat and shooting, but things to be aware of, he's similar to a Chapter Master in the way he does rerolls. He's got an always-on reroll 1s aura for core units, and he can choose a unit and they can reroll all hits. In addition, he can affect the canticles, so you can choose a Cult Mechanicus core unit and it can benefit from any canticle, even ones that have already been used.
Yeah, there are also some pretty great stratagems to help your characters even further, so they can deal mortal wounds to vehicles if they get into engagement range with them, and they can actually use many of their abilities twice using the Tech Adept stratagem. So for example, they can heal twice, the Engine Seer can give +1 to hit to 2 units, and the Techno-Archaeologist can allow 2 units to shoot whilst performing actions.
Let's talk about some Admech troop choices. Now first of all, you've got the Breachers and the Destroyers. These are their big sort of walking tanks. One thing you might want to watch out for on the Destroyers, for Riser, they have a stratagem 2TP, and they can increase the damage of plasma weapons by 1. Then of course you've got your 2 flavors of Scutari. You've got your Rangers and you've got your Vanguard. These are both quite cheap troops, and Rangers, they get a 3-inch pregame move, whereas Vanguard want to be a bit closer. They have a Rad Saturation aura, and when they're in engagement range, they take away 1 strength and 1 toughness from the enemies they are fighting. Now, here's where it gets spicy. There are some big combos that you can do with either Rangers or your Vanguard. So if we take a Manipulus Logi with Solar Flare and Luminescent Blessing, 20 Rangers with rifles, you give the Rangers extra 1 AP. You can get them to ignore -1 and -2 AP. You can get them so that they're only wounded on 4s. They solar flare their enemy, and they use the heavy to rapid fire stratagem to unleash 80 strength 4, -2 AP, 1 damage shots.
Yeah, these guys can be both incredibly killy and incredibly tough to shift for their points. That stratagem for auto wounding on 4s is just going to be so strong versus so many non-vehicle units. So let's move on then to the most religious parts of the Admech Codex, which is of course the Electro Priests. We have 2 types. Now they both do a huge amount of mortal wounds because they do them when they are charging, but the Fulgurite do additional mortal wounds when rolling 6s to wound in combat. Now after they've killed something, the Fulgurite, they add 1 to their invulnerable saves, making them a 4-up, and they add 1 to the roll, which means they'll do even more mortal wounds on the charge. So if you can kill them before they get into combat, that's going to really help you out later on. For the Corpuscari, they've got some really great shooting. There's also a stratagem called Electromancer's Wrath, which means that Electro Priests can do even more mortal wounds when in the shooting phase if they're within 12 inches of an enemy unit. And there is a stratagem for Cult Mechanicus Core, which the priests are, or characters, and it basically means that a unit with an engagement range of them will fight last.
Let's quickly mention the 2 flavors of Sicaran Assassin. You've got your Infiltrators, who are the ones with taser goads and flechette blasters. So beware here, because when you try and make an attacks against them and then you're within 12, you cannot reroll your hits or wounds. And in addition, they get to deploy anywhere on the battlefield. Now, both sets of Sicaran also have access to a stratagem that lets them redeploy, so if you thought they were one place, well, they can move off the battlefield edge and on somewhere else. Then you've got your Rust Stalkers. Wounds of 6 do mortal wounds in addition to any normal damage, and also when they have ranged attacks against them, they get extra benefits of cover.
Cerberus Raiders are a really neat little unit. They have some character sniping abilities and they can do mortal wounds on 6s, and they also have a stratagem, which means if they are the target of a charge, they can just move. So you're probably not going to be able to tie them down.
So you've got your 2 flavors of flying Skitarii. So the Flamey Boys, the Sterilizers, they can fall back and still charge, whereas the Skystalkers can fall back and still shoot. Now both of them have access to a really interesting stratagem, Booster Thrust, and this means at the end of your turn, you remove them from the table and then they get put in your next movement phase. So if you have enough CP, you can keep putting them on the table, shooting them, taking them off the table, put them somewhere else, so that's pretty neat. Then in addition, there's another stratagem, Deeply Sunk Talons, where if they're in engagement range of a Taraxii and they try and fall back on a 2+, they cannot fall back.
Other fast attacks they've got are of course the Ballistari and the Dragoons. The Dragoons are actually -1 to hit, which is pretty cool, and they've also got the Taser Launchers for all those exploding hits on 6s. There's actually a stratagem to make those hits explode on 5s.
Let's talk about everyone's favourite 50s robots, the Castellan robots. Now these guys are very tough, they come in squads, and they're very shooty or fighty or both now. So the interesting thing about them is they have different battle protocols. They start in the Aegis protocol, which means models in the unit will have a save of 2+. And then they can switch that to the Conqueror, where they have a weapon skill of 2+ and they can reroll charges, or the Protector, where they can no longer move but have a ballistic skill of 3+. And now they can switch these different protocols with their little friend, the Cybernetica Datasmith. When he is nearby, they also count as core, so suddenly a lot of these stratagems that affect Cult Mechanicus core units will start to affect them. This Datasmith can do an action, and then they can change to a different protocol later on in the battle. If you don't want to use your Datasmith, there is also a stratagem. For 1 CP, they can change to a different protocol, but they have to stay in that protocol for the rest of the battle. And I would be remiss if I didn't also mention their repulsor grids. They have a 5-up invulnerable save, and each time an invulnerable save is made for a model in that unit, it pings back, and an unmodified saving roll of 6, the attacking model's unit suffers 1 mortal wound. They of course are a really good unit for Wrath of Mars. This allows 6s to wound to mortal wounds in addition, although now this caps at 6 mortal wounds.
And whilst we won't go through every single ability again here that affects core, I think for things like the Lucius ability, where you're going to be able to teleport the robots across the board, definitely watch out for that one. And the last units we're going to talk about are, of course, the Archaeopters. Now, these all have access to something called the Chaff Launcher, which means they can get the smokescreen keyword for a stratagem that means they're going to be -1 to hit, and they'll have -1 to any damage taken for them. The Transvector also allows units to be transported. The Stratoraptor is essentially going to be a gunboat, and the Fusillade is a bomber. So as the Fusillade flies over a unit, you roll a dice for each model in the unit, or you roll 6 if it's a vehicle or monster, and on a 4-up for each of those, the unit suffers a mortal wound. So you can also pay a CP for the Fusillade to drop a seismic bomb, which is going to halve movement and advance and charge rolls. And any Archaeopter with a command uplink is going to be able to stop a unit within 6 inches from being affected by aura abilities. So we're going to move on then to the rest of the strats we wanted to mention for the Adeptus Mechanicus. So Skitarii can get +1 strength, and they do have a way for a Cult Mechanicus unit to count a different canticle as being active for this turn, even if that canticle has already been used.
The Admech, of course, are known for their vehicles. They build them all in their Forge Worlds. That's why they have Benevolence of the Omnissiah to give them a 4+ Feel No Pain against mortal wounds for vehicles, which makes my Haywire bikes sad. There's also Machine Spirit Resurgent. That means that the vehicles can count as on their top brackets, so even if you think you've got 1-on-1 wound, it can still shoot you as if it didn't have any wounds. And then if you finally do kill it, they've got Machine Spirit's Revenge, where they can automatically explode their vehicles.
And of course, as they build all the vehicles, they know how to tear them apart. So they have arc grenades, which can deal mortal wounds to vehicles. And they also have overloaded systems, which means that a vehicle can count as half its wounds for the purposes of degradation. But this can only happen after that vehicle has suffered damage from an arc weapon.
You've got Acquisition at any cost. They can automatically pass morale if within 6 inches of an objective. They also have Info Slave Skulls, which allows a core unit to shoot at something that's come in from reserves within 12.
And as that can now be done on robots when they're core, that makes my Gene Stealer Cults incredibly sad. And then finally, just a few Forge World specific stratagems. So Graia can deny any psychic power on a 4-up if they're within 18 inches of the Psyker. Stydies can make any of their units infiltrate, and Metallica can shoot so loudly they deafen their enemies, and a unit within 12 will have their movement halved and won't be able to set to defend or overwatch until your next turn. And that is all, folks. This is definitely quite a long one, because quite frankly there's just a lot packed into this codex. But thank you very much for listening. Please do like and subscribe, and we'll see you for the next one.